She didn't just whip my daughter's horse bloody, she tried to break its spine. And that's when everything changed. This isn't just a story about a horse and a little girl. It's about power, control, and what happens when a neighborhood association crosses every line it's supposed to protect. Have you ever dealt with a HOA that went way too far, where rules become weapons and neighbors become enemies? Drop a comment below. Where do you live? And have you ever faced something like this? Let's talk. My name is Emma. I'm 12 years old, and this is not a story about knights or princesses. It's a story about battles. Battles fought quietly, with invisible weapons, in a place that should have been safe but wasn't. It's about a girl, her horse, and a woman named Karen, who made it her mission to control everything and everyone, especially us. Every morning, before the sun fully woke up, I would slip out into the cold, damp air and find Thunder waiting for me in the paddock. Thunder isn't just a horse. He's my protector, my healer, my best friend in a world that often feels cold and unforgiving. His coat was a patchwork of black and white spots, a beautiful mess that reflected the chaos around us. I'd brush his mane slowly, feeling the soft strands slide through my fingers. His breath would come steady and calm, rising and falling with mine, as if our hearts beat in sync. Those moments were sacred, our ritual, against a world that seemed to want to tear us apart. But just beyond the white picket fence, behind the perfectly manicured lawns and freshly painted mailboxes, lived Karen Whitmore. She was the president of our homeowners association, the HOA, a woman who wore pearls like shackles and carried an air of self-importance that could choke a room. To her, Thunder wasn't a living creature. He was a problem, a liability, a stain on the pristine image she tried desperately to maintain. Karen didn't hide her disdain. Every time she passed our property, her nose would wrinkle in disgust. That animal, she spat one morning, is a threat to the community, and that girl, she's unstable. Those words hung heavy in the air, but silence was my answer. I had learned early on that silence often spoke louder than words. Karen's hatred wasn't just for Thunder or me, it was for what we represented: freedom, defiance, the messy, uncontrollable parts of life that didn't fit neatly into her HOA rulebook. She was a queen of rules, reigning over a kingdom built on fear, control, and the illusion of order. Behind her always followed Mike, her loyal shadow, clipboard in hand, eyes sharp and unblinking. His GoPro was almost a permanent fixture, recording everything, as if the slightest movement from Thunder or me could be used against us in some tribunal. Karen's weapon was the HOA's rulebook, a thick tome full of clauses, bylaws, and regulations designed to maintain community standards. But the only thing she maintained was her grip on power. And if that meant turning Thunder into a criminal, so be it. The accusations came fast and furious. Thunder was contaminating the environment, she claimed. Urinating near the flower beds along the walking trail was biohazardous, unsanitary, and a blight on the neighborhood. It felt absurd, like a bad joke. The Clean Water Act, the very law designed to protect our streams and lakes from real pollution, was twisted into a weapon used to bully a horse and his family. The neighborhood watched, mostly in silence. Some nodded in agreement with Karen, afraid to question the Queen's authority. Others looked away, unsure where they stood in a battle that felt too complicated for simple understanding. But I knew. I knew what Karen was really afraid of. She hated Thunder because he couldn't be controlled. She hated me because I refused to be afraid. That morning, when the sun was barely up and the fog clung to the grass like a shroud, Karen came knocking, not a polite neighborly knock, but sharp and impatient, like a judge delivering a verdict before hearing the case. I opened the door, still in my pajamas, clutching a half-finished cup of coffee my mom had left out for me. There she stood, pearls gleaming, lips curled in a sneer that promised trouble. "Your livestock has violated HOA boundary expectations again," she said, voice syrupy but cold. I stepped outside, planting myself between Karen and Thunder, grazing quietly in the mist. "He's a horse," I said flatly, "not livestock. And this is our land, not yours." Karen's smile sharpened like a blade. Your animal was seen urinating near the rose beds. That's a violation. Mike raised his clipboard, pointing to page 14, subsection D, HOA cleanliness clause. I laughed, bitter and humorless. You're policing horse pee now. Karen's expression didn't change. If you won't remove the animal, we will. That threat hung in the air, a silent storm brewing. Later that day, a new fence post appeared, steel and sharp, barbed wire wrapping around it like a warning sign. Thunder sensed it too. His ears pinned back, body tense. I stood there, heart pounding, knowing that this was no longer about rules or community standards. This was war. The barbed wire wasn't just metal wrapped around a post. It was a line drawn in the dirt, a challenge, a threat, a declaration that Karen and her HOA weren't going to back down. And neither could I. Thunder shifted nervously, his hoof scraping the ground as if he too felt the weight of the coming storm. I wrapped my arms around his neck and whispered, "We're in this together." Days passed with more visits from Karen and Mike, each time armed with new violations, new threats. HOA meetings turned into stage performances, where Karen's words cut deeper than any blade, and Mike's camera captured every inch of our lives, twisting them into evidence of non-compliance. One afternoon, Karen showed up again, whip in hand, a leather lash braided thick, its knot weighted and sinister. She struck Thunder with it, the crack echoing like a gunshot across the paddock. Blood welled up where the whip hit, dark and shocking against Thunder's spotted coat. I froze, the world narrowing to the pounding of my heart and the screams caught in my throat. My forehead burned where I'd fallen to the ground in shock, but it was the look in Thunder's eyes that terrified me, the mix of pain, confusion, and a fire that would not be doused. You'll regret this. I warned Karen, voice low but fierce. She smiled, cold and cruel. If the HOA won't act, I will. What followed was a chaos I hadn't expected. Thunder reared up, nostrils flared, hooves thundering down with a force that shook the ground. The whip dropped into the mud as I stepped between them. I said no more. I told Karen. She stumbled back, heels catching in the churned earth, face a mask of shock and fury. Mike kept filming, his smirk twisting into something unreadable. That day, the line had been crossed, not just in rules, but in respect, in dignity, in the fragile peace I'd tried to hold on to for so long. The neighborhood started paying attention. Whispers turned into conversations, conversations into meetings. Faces once indifferent now showed signs of sympathy, or at least curiosity. But Karen doubled down. She called the police, cited trespassing, claimed assault. The HOA board meetings became battlefields where words were weapons sharper than knives. The law was thrown around like confetti, but justice, that was another matter. In reality, the laws meant to protect animals and children were clear. The Animal Welfare Act prohibits cruelty to animals, while child endangerment laws protect minors from harm and neglect. But in the maze of HOA rules and petty disputes, those protections often get lost. I knew that. I had to make sure no one else got hurt, not Thunder, not me. Each day, I reminded myself, silence is permission. If I didn't stand up, nothing would change. But standing up came with a cost. Karen's power was built on fear and paperwork, but her real weapon was control, the kind that suffocates, that makes neighbors turn their heads, that makes you question your own worth. Yet in the quiet moments, brushing Thunder's mane, feeling his warm breath against my cheek, I found strength, not from laws or rules, but from love, from loyalty, from knowing that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not with swords, but with hearts that refuse to break. The days after Karen's threat were the hardest we'd ever faced. Every knock at the door sent a shiver down my spine, not because I feared strangers, but because I knew exactly who was on the other side. It was Karen, always Karen, and Mike, with his clipboard and that damn GoPro, recording every moment as if waiting for the perfect excuse to turn my life upside down. Karen had made it her personal mission to make Thunder disappear. Every rule in the HOA handbook suddenly became a weapon aimed right at us. There were clauses about livestock and community cleanliness that no one ever cared about until they were used to bully a 12-year-old girl and her horse. The HOA rules themselves were dense, packed with legal jargon that sounded important, but meant little to someone like me. I overheard my mom explaining to Dad how the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs, allowed the HOA to enforce rules that could dictate everything from the color of our mailbox to the kind of animals we kept. It was like living in a cage disguised as a neighborhood. Karen didn't stop at threats. She came with notices, letters, and once, a formal cease and desist order claiming that Thunder's presence was an environmental hazard. The irony wasn't lost on me. I remembered learning about the Clean Water Act in school, the law designed to keep our water clean and safe. But here, it was twisted to criminalize a horse simply doing what horses do. The neighbors, too, were caught in the crossfire. Some glanced at us with pity, others with suspicion. I saw whispered conversations behind closed doors and felt the cold shoulder from those too scared to take sides. It was like Karen's shadow had stretched over the entire community, silencing dissent before it even had a chance to speak. Then came the day. I'll never forget the day Karen crossed the line. I was brushing Thunder's neck near the fence when I heard it, the sharp crack of leather against flesh. My heart stopped. Karen stood inside the paddock, whip raised high, her face a mask of icy determination. The whip came down hard on Thunder's side, and blood blossomed where the skin broke. Thunder flinched, muscles tensing in pain, but he didn't run. He stayed, as if waiting for me. "Stop!" I screamed, rushing forward, but Karen didn't flinch. "If the HOA won't act," she said coldly, "I will." Mike was filming, his grin sick and wide. I felt rage like fire coursing through me. No one was going to hurt Thunder, not without consequences. I vaulted over the fence, heart pounding, hands trembling. I ripped the whip from Karen's grasp and threw it into the mud like it was poison. "You put your hands on my horse," I growled. "You put a hand on me, and you declared war." Karen stumbled back, heels sinking into the churned earth, eyes wild but proud. He urinated on community property. She spat. "I'm just enforcing the rules." Rules, I laughed, bitter and fierce. This isn't about rules. It's about control. Thunder shifted beside me, nostrils flaring. I whispered the word I'd practiced in my head since that awful day crush. Thunder reared, hooves slicing the air, and charged. Karen's scream was the sound of a queen losing her kingdom. Her heels caught in the mud, and she fell. Makeup running, dignity shattered like glass. But Thunder didn't trample her. He didn't need to. His hooves pounded the earth near her, spraying dirt and chaos. It was a warning, a declaration. This is our land. This is our life. The crowd that had gathered gasped, some stepping back, others frozen in shock. I stood beside Thunder, breath ragged but steady, knowing nothing would ever be the same. After that day, there was no going back. The quiet life we once knew dissolved into a battleground. Karen's threats turned into full-blown campaigns. Notices appeared on our door, each one longer and more threatening than the last. Violation of HOA guidelines, environmental contamination, nuisance to the community, words meant to intimidate, to wear us down. My parents tried to stay calm, but I could see the tension in their eyes. Mom spent hours on the phone with lawyers and animal protection groups. Dad repaired fences that Karen's minions damaged during their inspections. All while, I kept watch over Thunder, who seemed to carry the weight of the entire neighborhood on his shoulders. Karen's obsession with control was like a poison. At HOA meetings, she presented herself as a guardian of the community, but beneath her polished veneer was something far more dangerous: the hunger to crush anything that didn't bow to her rules. Mike, ever the loyal lieutenant, filmed our every move. It felt like living under a microscope, our privacy stripped away. Every gesture recorded and twisted into evidence of wrongdoing. The GoPro became a symbol of oppression, a reminder that we were constantly being watched and judged. But despite the isolation, a small spark of defiance flickered. Some neighbors, who had once stayed silent out of fear or convenience, began to question Karen's reign. Whispers of support for us circulated quietly sometimes, in hushed conversations over fences, sometimes in anonymous notes left on our doorstep. Then came the day that tested everything. It was late afternoon, and the sky was heavy with the threat of rain. I was brushing Thunder's mane near the paddock when I saw her Karen striding across the field like a queen preparing for battle. Her white slacks were spotless, her heels clicking against the dirt with purpose. In her hand was the whip. The crack of the leather against Thunder's flank shattered the air. Blood welled where the whip struck, and my stomach turned. "Stop it!" I screamed, running toward her. But she didn't pause. Another strike, harder this time. Tears blurred my vision as I vaulted the fence and tore the whip from her hand, throwing it to the ground. "You don't get to do this," I said, voice shaking but resolute. "Not to him, not to me," Karen sneered, stepping back but not defeated. "If the HOA won't act, I will." Mike's camera whirred, capturing every moment, every expression. Thunder, injured but fierce, reared up at my command. "Crush," I whispered, heart pounding. The horse charged. Karen's scream echoed across the paddock as she stumbled and fell, her pristine image splattered with mud and dirt. But Thunder stopped just short of trampling her. His message clear: this was no longer a fight about rules. This was about survival. The neighbors who had gathered stared in stunned silence. Some gasped, others whispered prayers. The moment had changed everything. The aftermath of that day was chaos wrapped in silence. Karen lay sprawled in the mud, her carefully curated image shattered along with her authority. Mud smeared her white slacks. Her pearl necklace was broken, scattered across the dirt like the lies she'd spun for years. But what struck me most was the look in her eyes: shock, fear, and something I'd never seen before: vulnerability. For the first time, Karen wasn't the queen of this neighborhood. She was just a woman, exposed and powerless. But Karen didn't go quietly. She rallied her small army, the HOA board members, the few neighbors still loyal to her, and Mike, whose GoPro had recorded every moment. Their narrative was swift and merciless: assault, trespassing, animal aggression, words meant to turn the tables, to paint us as the villains. Yet the truth was clearer than ever. Animal cruelty laws in our state were unequivocal. The Animal Welfare Act and state statutes prohibited exactly what Karen had done. She had used a weapon, a whip, against a defenseless animal. Worse, she had endangered a child, my 12-year-old self, by inflicting trauma not just on Thunder, but on me. My parents hired a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes and animal law. We gathered evidence, photos of Thunder's wounds, medical reports from the vet, video footage from neighbors who had seen Karen's violence. The legal process was daunting, a maze of hearings, affidavits, and procedural battles. Meanwhile, the community began to fracture. Some neighbors, emboldened by the truth, spoke out against Karen. Others clung to the old order, afraid to face what change might bring. The HOA meetings became a battleground of rhetoric and resentment. Through it all, Thunder remained my anchor. Despite his injuries, he greeted me each morning with steady eyes and patient breath. Together, we faced the storm. And then came the moment that turned the tide: the Crush incident. It wasn't just Thunder's defiant charge that shocked the neighborhood. It was what it represented: a stand against tyranny, a refusal to be silenced. Karen's fall from grace was as much psychological as it was physical. She realized that power built on fear was fragile. Her threats lost their bite. Her voice, once commanding, became shrill and desperate. But the scars remained not just on Thunder's flank or on my forehead from the fall, but in the collective psyche of our neighborhood. We had seen the monster behind the pearls and rules. In the quiet aftermath, as the mud dried and the community reeled, I learned a vital truth sometimes. Standing up means breaking the silence, even when the cost is high. It means facing the monster with open eyes and an unyielding heart. The morning of the HOA meeting arrived like the calm before a storm. The community center was buzzing, not with laughter or light chatter, but with tension thick enough to choke. Neighbors who rarely spoke found themselves crowded into the room, eyes flickering with curiosity, fear, and anticipation. Karen sat at the head of the table, her posture regal, pearls glinting under the harsh fluorescent lights. But today, her smile was tighter, less assured. Around her, the HOA board members whispered among themselves, casting wary glances toward the entrance where I stood, holding Thunder's lead rope with steady hands. The room was divided. Some faces were familiar friends who'd come out of quiet solidarity to support me. Others were old acquaintances now turned into distant strangers, their allegiance still with Karen or uncertain. It felt like watching a kingdom on the brink of collapse. When the meeting began, Karen launched into a rehearsed speech, full of legal jargon and accusations. "We are here to uphold community standards," she intoned, "to protect our property values and ensure safety for all residents." But the words fell flat against the weight of evidence my family and I brought forward. Photos of Thunder's wounds, vet reports, videos recorded by neighbors all laid bare the truth Karen tried so desperately to bury. One by one, witnesses spoke up, their voices shaky at first, but growing stronger testimonies of Karen's intimidation, her violence, and her obsession with control. Karen's composure cracked. The Queen's mask slipped, revealing desperation, anger, and finally, a flicker of fear. Her voice, once commanding, now faltered as the community saw the woman behind the pearls for what she truly was, a tyrant clinging to a fragile crown. The room shifted. The air thickened with murmurs of disbelief and dawning clarity. People who had stayed silent found their voices, joining in the chorus demanding change. I stood beside Thunder, heart pounding but calm, feeling the tide turn. The community was waking up from a long, uncomfortable silence, and justice was no longer just a word. It was a movement. Karen's reign was over. The room seemed to shrink under the weight of the truth. Karen's once unwavering confidence now crumbled like the brittle pages of the HOA rulebook she clung to. She sat rigid, lips pressed so tightly together it looked as though she were trying to hold back a storm of words, threats, and excuses. One of the board members, Mrs. Gallinger, a woman known for her quiet watchfulness, finally spoke. Her voice was calm, but carried an unmistakable authority. "Karen, we have all seen the evidence. This is no longer about maintaining order. It's about cruelty and fear. We cannot allow this to continue." There was a ripple through the crowd, a few gasps, some nods. Karen's face twitched, an almost imperceptible sneer playing at the corner of her mouth. "You're all sheep," she spat. "Without me, this neighborhood would fall apart." It was almost laughable. The Queen reduced to a desperate accusation, trying to shame a room full of neighbors who were tired of living in her shadow. The irony was bitter. A community built on the illusion of harmony was actually held hostage by one woman's need for control. One by one, more neighbors stepped forward, their voices a mixture of regret, apology, and resolve. Stories emerged of times they'd witnessed Karen's harshness, the quiet suffering they had ignored, the fear that had silenced them. I watched, heart swelling with a mix of relief and sadness. Relief that the truth was finally out. Sadness for a community that had let cruelty fester in silence. Karen's protests grew louder, more erratic. "You don't understand the consequences," she warned, her voice shaking. "This isn't just about rules. It's about respect. It's about order." But the room no longer listened. Her words fell on deaf ears, drowned out by the collective will for change. As the meeting drew to a close, Karen sat alone, her empire dismantled piece by piece. The pearls that once symbolized her status lay scattered like forgotten relics of a fading reign. I led Thunder out into the sunlight, feeling the warmth on my face and the steady beat of his heart beside me. For the first time in months, I felt hope not just for myself, but for everyone who had suffered under Karen's shadow. Justice wasn't perfect, but it was real, and in that moment, it was enough. The echoes of Karen's collapse hung in the air long after the meeting ended. The community center emptied slowly, voices softened to murmurs as neighbors drifted away, some avoiding eye contact, others lingering with tentative smiles of solidarity. The invisible walls Karen had built around this neighborhood were cracking. I felt their eyes on me and Thunder as we stepped outside. Some were filled with admiration, others with guilt. The same streets where Karen's whispers once sowed fear now buzzed with a cautious hope. A few brave souls approached, offering quiet words of encouragement or simply nodding in respect. It was the beginning of something new, a community reclaiming itself. But change is never simple. Karen didn't disappear quietly. She lashed out behind the scenes, summoning her allies, trying to twist the narrative. Flyers appeared on mailboxes with misleading versions of events. Online forums buzzed with accusations painting me as the aggressor, Thunder as a dangerous animal, and Karen as the victim. The battle spilled beyond the community center, into homes and screens. Yet, even in the chaos, cracks formed in Karen's facade. Her attempts to manipulate unraveled as more neighbors stepped forward, sharing their truths. People who had once been silent found courage in numbers. The fear that had kept them shackled loosened its grip. At home, the weight of the ordeal pressed heavily on me and my family. Mom and Dad fought exhaustion from endless calls, meetings, and legal consultations. Thunder's wounds were healing, but the emotional scars ran deeper. Still, we held on, knowing this fight was bigger than any of us alone. In those moments of quiet after the storm, I realized what this really was, a reckoning. A community forced to face its shadows and decide whether to stand for justice or fall back into complacency. The final blow to Karen's reign came not in courtrooms or meetings, but in the court of public opinion. Videos of that day, Thunder's charge, Karen's fall, her cruelty went viral. Social media became a stage where truth outshone fear, where a horse and a girl became unlikely symbols of resistance. Karen Whitmore, once untouchable, was now a figure of ridicule and scorn. Her control shattered, her name scrubbed from HOA documents, her influence evaporating like morning mist. And through it all, Thunder and I stood firm, scarred but unbroken, a living testament to the power of standing up when silence would have been easier. The community we once knew was gone, replaced by something raw, honest, and fragile, but it was ours, and that made all the difference. The day of the trial felt like the culmination of every sleepless night, every whispered threat, every scar both seen and unseen. Our small-town courthouse was packed with faces familiar and foreign, all drawn by the story that had rippled far beyond our quiet neighborhood. I stood beside Thunder, who had come with us, his coat still marked by the wounds Karen had inflicted. He was more than a horse now. He was a symbol of resilience, a silent witness to the battle for truth. Our lawyer, Ms. Reynolds, was calm and confident. She had spent countless hours reviewing the HOA bylaws, animal welfare laws, and child protection statutes that would underpin our case. Her knowledge was a shield against the storm Karen's legal team promised to unleash. The courtroom buzzed as the judge entered, a stern woman with sharp eyes that seemed to see through every pretense. The trial began with opening statements. Karen's attorney spinning tales of self-defense, emotional distress, and community safety. But Ms. Reynolds countered with cold facts, blunt and unassailable. She laid out the evidence with precision photos of Thunder's wounds, veterinary reports confirming abuse, testimony from witnesses who had seen Karen's violent acts firsthand. She cited the Animal Welfare Act, emphasizing its prohibition against cruel treatment of animals, and referenced state child endangerment laws protecting me from harm. Karen's defense faltered when confronted with the unyielding truth. Her lawyers tried to argue HOA rights and property rules, but the judge reminded them that no amount of neighborhood regulation could justify abuse or endangerment. Throughout the trial, I felt a strange mix of fear and strength. Fear of what might happen, but strength from knowing that justice was on our side. Thunder's steady presence was a comfort, a reminder that we were fighting for more than just ourselves. When the verdict came, the courtroom fell silent. Karen Whitmore was found guilty on multiple counts: trespassing, animal abuse, and child endangerment. The judge ordered revocation of her HOA presidency, imposed fines, mandated psychological evaluation, and required restitution for medical and veterinary expenses. As the gavel fell, a wave of relief and vindication washed over me. The battle had been long and brutal, but justice had prevailed. The courtroom remained tense as the trial progressed. Witness after witness stepped forward: neighbors, veterinarians, even a child psychologist, each painting a picture that left little room for doubt. Karen's cold, Calculated cruelty was exposed in stark relief against the innocent loyalty of Thunder and the quiet courage of a 12-year-old girl. Ms. Reynolds skillfully wove the legal threads together. She invoked the Animal Welfare Act, a federal law protecting animals from neglect and abuse, emphasizing how Karen's actions crossed every boundary of humane treatment. The state's child endangerment laws were brought into focus, next laws that criminalize putting a child in harm's way, whether physical or psychological. By striking Thunder, Karen had not only injured the animal, but endangered me as well. Karen's legal team scrambled to defend her by citing the HOA's authority and suggesting that Thunder's presence itself was a violation. They argued Karen's actions were a response to provocation and protecting the community. But the judge was unyielding. She made it clear that HOA regulations could not override fundamental protections guaranteed by state and federal law. The media had taken notice, and cameras flashed as the verdict was read. The judge sentenced Karen Whitmore to revoke her HOA presidency and imposed fines hefty enough to send a clear message. Psychological counseling was mandated to address her violent tendencies, and a restraining order was put in place to protect our family. The court also ordered financial restitution for veterinary bills and medical expenses incurred because of her actions. As the gavel struck, relief flooded through me, tempered by the weight of the ordeal we had endured. Justice had been served, but the scars both on Thunder and on me would take time to heal. Outside the courthouse, supporters gathered, their faces bright with hope and solidarity. For the first time in a long while, I felt the true meaning of community, not as a cage of rules and fear, but as a network of people willing to stand up for what's right. At home, life slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy. Thunder's wounds healed, and his spirit remained unbroken. I learned that justice wasn't just a legal verdict, it was the courage to keep standing, the willingness to speak up, and the strength to protect what you love. The trial was more than a personal victory, it was a statement. In a world where power can be wielded to intimidate and control, truth and resilience can still prevail. The months that followed the trial were a slow, steady journey toward healing for Thunder, for me, and for our community. The wounds on Thunder's side faded, replaced by scars that told stories of survival and strength. His gait grew sure again, his eyes bright with the same quiet courage that had carried us through the darkest days. I found peace in the simple rhythms of daily life, brushing Thunder's mane under the morning sun, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath my palm, and knowing that together we had weathered a storm no law book could fully capture. But recovery was more than physical. It was about reclaiming our voices, rebuilding trust, and forging a new path forward. The neighborhood, once divided and shadowed by fear, began to change. The HOA dissolved, replaced by a community council committed to fairness and respect. Old grievances were spoken aloud, apologies offered not always perfect, but genuine. Neighbors who had once turned away now looked me in the eye with newfound understanding. The silence that had protected cruelty was broken, replaced by conversations that mattered. Through it all, I learned the true meaning of power not in the chains of control, but in the courage to stand firm, to speak up, and to protect what we love. Karen's reign had been built on fear and rules, but our victory came from resilience, compassion, and an unyielding belief in justice. Sometimes, the hardest battles aren't fought with weapons, but with hearts unwilling to break. As I sat beside Thunder one evening, the sun dipping low and painting the sky in shades of hope, I realized this story wasn't just about us. It was about every person who's ever faced silence and chosen to speak. Every community that's ever been broken and dared to heal. Justice is never perfect, and peace is never easy. But when we stand together, when we refuse to be silenced, we create a world where monsters lose their power and hope rises, unbroken. This story is a powerful reminder that silence can sometimes enable cruelty, and unchecked power can destroy lives. But standing up no matter how hard is the first step to change. If you've ever faced a situation where someone abused their power or felt trapped by unfair rules, know you're not alone. It's time to raise your voice and take back control. Thanks for watching HOA Karen File. If this story moved you, hit that like button, share it with others, And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story that matters. Together, we can expose the truth and protect what's right.